semester for our department seminars. And we are very fortunate to have someone with us today from Canada. He flew all the way from Ontario, started yesterday afternoon, arrived late last night, and still is up and ready to present a topic that he's been working on for the last 5-6 years of his life, and he's very much eager to share with us his experiences. Today we have Dr. Andrew Keeney, assistant professor at the University of Toronto, and he is also working, half of his work is also with the state of Ontario, the province of Ontario, and I think he's the coordinator of the Southern Ontario Woodlands Project at the Federation of Ontario Naturalists. He also has his own private firm, consulting firm, W.A. Kenny and Associates, also dealing with urban and community forestry projects. So without much ado, I give you Dr. Kenny from Ontario.
Thanks very much, Adele. Thank you. First of all, thanks very much for the invitation. Really appreciate the chance, and as Lita says, to come down and share some of these ideas with you. So I hope I'm going to get some input. Be critical and make some suggestions on some of these issues that I'm talking about. And I should mention that this Federation of Ontario Naturalists, and I don't know, it's probably safe to say that in this group, but my daughter, who's 19, her boyfriend asked her what her dad did, and he said, well, he works at U of T. He also works with the Federation of Ontario Naturalists, and somehow he's French-Canadian, and he wasn't quite familiar with the English term, and somehow he figures that I run around in the woods with no clothes on. I don't do that. So it's naturalist, and I don't know what those other terms are, but so don't be confused by that. So what I wanted to do today is, this title is probably really presumptuous. There isn't enough time, I guess, to deal with all the issues of looking at urban forests as ecosystems. But what I wanted to do is open up maybe a little bit of a discussion on this idea of moving beyond an arboricultural perspective of urban forestry. And to do that, I wanted to introduce you a little bit, first of all, to urban forestry issues in Canada. And again, just a bit of a flavor of that to try to set the stage for where we're coming from with some of these concerns and the idea of moving this issue ahead. So I put up this definition, or this objective of urban forest management. This in itself might generate some discussion a little later on, but I think this sort of encapsulates the way I see urban forest management coming together, and the idea of maximizing benefits, whatever these benefits may be, from the urban forest by maintaining a healthy, diverse urban forest canopy. And also not just the trees, but the shrubs. And some work we're doing with Dave Nowak from the USDA Forest Service in Toronto now, we're finding that the shrub layer is an important component of this urban forest. And I think that's something that's often forgotten. So that is an issue that has to be addressed to a certain degree. The idea of minimum risk has to be up there, because I don't know what the municipal foresters in Iowa concern themselves with, but certainly liability is a big issue with the folks that are managing the forests in Ontario and across the country. So dealing with risk is an important side of that as well. So what I want to do is, first of all, as I said, give you a bit of a perspective of Canadian urban forestry issues, just a few points, mainly based on a survey that we did a couple of years ago. Then to look at some of the benefits that we derive from the urban forest. Not to bore you with that, I'm sure you're all very familiar with these benefits and could probably tell me a lot more about how the processes work. But I want to use that as a mechanism to get into this idea of looking at the urban forest from a bit of a different perspective. And then I want to suggest this idea of what we're referring to as potential leaf area density as another measure of urban forest structure to guide planning and management, and I think it has a certain educational appeal to it as well. And certainly running the idea out to some of the folks that I've spoken to over the last few months, it gets them thinking about the urban forest in a little bit of a different way. So we'll introduce you to that, and then very quickly discuss maybe some of the things that I see that we need to move the yardsticks ahead. So what's the situation of urban forestry in Canada? Well, 78% of Canadians live in urban environments, probably very similar to the US. I'm sure it is. What is an urban area? And I've used the definition that Census Canada uses, just as an urban area in their census divisions, are defined as any populated areas with more than 1,000 people and a population density of 400 people per square kilometer, or greater, of course. And so when I put this into the GIS, just get little dots around the countryside. And of course, the urban forest doesn't stop at the town line. I live in the city of Guelph, just west of Toronto. It's got an agricultural university. You may have heard of it. But my back property line is also the town line. So I'm in the city, and a meter the other side of the fence is rural. Doesn't make sense, does it? Obviously, the urban environment has a broader influence than that. So what do we use for that zone of influence? I don't know. I just picked 10 kilometers out of the air and said, well, let's put a 10-kilometer buffer on these fragments that you can see across the country and say that's the urban environment. Now, when we get up into northern Ontario or northern Saskatchewan, some of those small communities there, if you go 10 kilometers beyond the town limits from that, you're right in the middle of the bush. You go 5 kilometers, you're in the middle of the bush. So up there at 10 kilometers is probably far too generous. However, southern Ontario, down on that big massive blob down there in the lower right-hand corner where I live, 10 kilometers is probably very conservative. That the influence of those cities reaches probably far beyond that. So bear with me on the 10 kilometers. It's just the idea to try to give some sort of visual impact of the extent of urban forestry in the country. And of course, this is something that I have to sell to my colleagues in conventional forestry in Canada as well. They may be foresters, but they don't necessarily, that doesn't mean that they have a good understanding of what urban forestry is. In fact, sometimes they're, and I say this as a forester, sometimes they're not prepared to see that as something broader than just trees and pots along the main streets of Toronto. So let's look at Canada a little bit more closely with this definition in mind. Move out to the west coast, and we're going to quickly take a flight east. So we see these little patches here and there with this 10-kilometer buffer. The lower mainland, Vancouver, Victoria at the bottom end of Vancouver Island, and so on. And then these little patches of communities across the southern part of British Columbia. Into the prairies, Saskatchewan and Manitoba, again, you see fairly distributed, dispersed areas around these communities. But when you get into southern Ontario, which I've argued for the longest time is all urban forest, and sometimes I get a good discussion going that way, when I did this buffer approach, it ends up looking like most of southern Ontario really is urban forest from that definition. There's some little patches of green in there that you can see, and I would challenge you to find those on the ground and say this is remarkably different than something 2 or 3 kilometers further along that's in that urban area. So the point is that this is a fairly large area, and I think it'd be interesting to do the same with maps of the eastern U.S. and so on, to see how really far that influence goes. And then can't forget our friends to the east in the Atlantic zone, and again we get this dispersed area. So anyway, we've got a fairly broad distribution, but it's not an insignificant area. We've done a couple of surveys, repeated the same questions basically asked twice, once in '96 and once in '99, and in both of those cases we asked the municipal foresters to think back or go back through their records for the previous 3 years. So this survey that we conducted really covers the ground from '96 to '99, and we asked about 25 questions or something. I'm not going to force you to listen to all of the results in this today, but just a few points to raise here. We looked at communities with 5,000 people or more, and we only had a 15% response rate, which probably isn't too bad for a mail-in survey, but it turns out that 15% really covered most municipalities, a fairly large proportion of the municipalities, and a fairly large proportion of the population, simply because we were getting most of the responses from the fairly large communities, I guess you could say. So the points that some of the issues that I wanted to raise here were really to set the stage for this issue of urban forests and ecosystem management. So we asked, do you have a street tree inventory? I have to emphasize, these are municipal forests. We're not really talking about urban forests, because urban forests, from my mind, have to incorporate all of the vegetation, all of the area in the municipality. And of course, that's only about maybe 10 to 20% is under the jurisdiction of the municipality itself. So this is really a small proportion. However, as you'll see, in most cases, this is the only level of broader management, and in many cases there's not a heck of a lot of management going on there either. So we asked, do you have a street tree inventory? And by the way, these 4 pie charts represent communities 5,000 to 10,000, 10 to 50, 50 to 100, and greater than 100,000. And you probably can't see it up there, but the yes response is yellow, so focus in on the yellow on these pie charts. So what we see is, in these smaller communities, only about a third of them have an inventory, have any idea of what their resource is. And when we look at the larger communities, it's a little bit more encouraging in that, and over here it's quite interesting that it looks like the 50 to 100K have inventories than the larger communities. That's a bit of an artifact of the data, because there were more respondents here. There were fairly few municipalities. I'm afraid I can't remember exactly how many responded here, but that's part of what we're seeing. So it looks a little bit more encouraging there. However, we delved a little bit further, and I think you'll all agree that an inventory isn't, all inventories aren't created equal, as I said here. If you've got your inventory in a stack of computer cards and paper sheets, okay, how important is that as a planning and management tool? I don't know. So we thought, we'll ask you then, if you do have it, or ask those same communities, is your inventory on a computer? Is it computerized? And of course, as we'd expect, the numbers drop down considerably. So that we're seeing that even in the larger communities, only a little bit more, or 50% of the largest communities, or 2/3 of this middle group, have inventories. And so that should raise a flag right there. If you don't know what the resource is, how do you manage it in any way, much less at the ecosystem level? Okay, so keep that in mind. That's a bit of a challenge that we face right there. And of course, if you got an inventory and it's computerized, but it's just sitting in your computer, it's still not doing you any good. So do you have a strategic urban forest plan? That was the question. Do you have a strategic urban forest plan? And we intentionally left it very vague. Just left it at that, didn't try to describe at all what we meant by a strategic urban forest plan. This is a response we got. So again, in those small communities, about a quarter of them said they had a plan, and only about half of the larger communities had a plan for this resource that they're responsible for. So why did I emphasize the fact that I didn't define a strategic urban forest plan? Well, we went to these folks after they responded yes, phoned them up and said, we're really encouraged to see this, and you mentioned that you've got a strategic urban forest plan. Would you possibly send us a copy of your plan, because it'd be really great for educational purposes? And it was really interesting, the number of people that said, well, we've got a plan, it's just that we really haven't gotten around to writing it down yet. But rest assured, we have a plan. Others said, we've got a plan and it'll be in the mail tomorrow. And in most cases, in virtually all cases, those were what I would consider to be arboricultural plans. They were pruning plans. They may have been planting plans, and so on. What do I mean by a strategic urban forest plan? I'm looking at something that has a lifespan of 20 to 25 years with nested 5-year plans perhaps, or annual operating plans nested in those, with a clear objective, definition of areas of concern for the urban forest as a whole. You could even get into issues of public education, safety, species diversity, all those, that sort of thing. But at least something that takes you further than a pruning plan or some method of reactionary approach to storm damage and that sort of thing. We don't really have any good examples of that in Canadian municipalities that I've been able to find digging for these over the last number of years. So that should be something that, or that is something that is a concern and is really driving a lot of the work that we're doing in our research and our extension and working with communities to try to move this process along so that we can work towards the idea of managing from an ecosystem basis. Okay, I mentioned maximizing benefits, and in order to have those plans, to have that strategy, to be looking at the community or the urban forest as an ecosystem, to try to maximize those benefits. Well, what are some of these? And I said I'm not going to try to belabor all of these or go into them in great detail. I'm sure you're very familiar with them, but there's a point I want to make in addressing at least the first three in this list. And this list, I'm sure you're all aware of. It's probably in every brochure that every municipal tree planting organization distributes. They're in the flyers that go with the hydro company build and so on, so they're very common. And we're only starting to get a handle on quantifying some of these. But I think they've got something in common that is interesting and helps us to look at the urban forest as an ecosystem and guides us along the road in that level of management. So let's look at least the first three of these to try to get this point across. So improved air quality, and of course this is a very timely issue. And one of the mechanisms that's at play here is the absorption of gaseous pollutants through the stomata and absorption into the moisture within the leaf tissue. The point I'm trying to make, or the reason I'm raising this here, is the importance of the leaf area. The functioning organ, if you will, of the urban forest becomes the leaf surface area. And that's going to be the recurring theme here, if I can say that. So the absorption of these gaseous pollutants into the leaves. And some of the work that Dave Nowak has done in Chicago and other places now, and we're just completing running that same model, the U4 model, for the city of Toronto. The data is we're just finishing crunching those numbers, and the report should be out soon, and I can put our numbers up here instead of Chicago's. Couple of points here. If we look at the absorption of gaseous pollutants by the forest of Chicago, we see that individual trees don't really absorb very much on a tree-by-tree basis. And I'm sure there's people in here that have had phone calls, particularly you calls, with somebody saying, my neighbor wants to cut down a big tree, I want to stop it. Tell me how much this tree is contributing towards improved environment, and that way I can take it to the city. And you know, if you say, well, it's taken 3 grams of sulfur dioxide out of the air last year, it's not going to sell very much. So the first point is individual trees don't do a heck of a lot. The other point is, very obviously and not surprisingly, big trees take a lot more out than small trees. Sounds trivial, but it's important. Okay, so those 2 points. The next point for this discussion is when we start looking at the forest, the urban forest of Chicago, not surprisingly, now our numbers are going from a few grams up to metric tons per year. So the issue again is if we're starting to look at the urban forest as an ecosystem, it's a bit easier to sell this as an approach or as a benefit in terms of air quality. And of course, if we can't sell people on that, we put a dollar value on it, it might convince them a little bit more. Take-home messages: individual trees don't contribute much, big trees contribute much more, but the urban forest as an ecosystem plays a very substantial role. Another thing that Dave does that I like is he compares the production of these pollutants by the city of Chicago, and then you start looking at these numbers again, and they become insignificant again. But there is a role, you contribute, it is a contribution, and I think we have to look at a whole suite of benefits, not just one issue alone. Okay, microclimate amelioration associated with that, and again, you know all these numbers. Urban forest centers 3 to 5 degrees centigrade warmer and so on, and dampening out some of those fluctuations from the diurnal fluctuations. And the fact that, again, the urban forest canopy plays this role in mitigating some of this urban heat island effect. And so come back to the issues of that canopy and the leaf cover the leaf area density, as I'll get into a little bit later. So how does this happen? Well, partly through shading. And again, do the leaves play a role here? Yes, I'd argue that this again is the lowest level, if we can, or the most basic level of the components of that urban forest in playing this role in terms of shade. And evapotranspirational cooling, sort of the reverse of the thing that we were talking about with the pollutants. So the evaporation from the leaf surface and through the stomata, and again, the leaves play a major role here, and the idea of wind reduction. And again, I don't want, the point isn't to go into these in all in detail, but looking at the urban forest as a canopy, as an entity into itself is the point here. Oops, sorry about that. And just this idea of aesthetics and property value. And again, if we were to compare the property value if everything else was the same, the property value in this community down on the bottom with the community at the top, I think you could see that canopy cover, leaf area density, and those issues play a role in governing some of these economic aspects of the urban forest. So, looking at those three to try to drive this idea home that one of the measures that we could look at in terms of the urban forest as an ecosystem is canopy cover, or I would argue even more appropriately, leaf area density. And I'd like to go into that a little bit further and just sort of saying that these benefits are all related to the leaf area density of the urban forest, and therefore to maximize those benefits we should be looking at maximizing the leaf area density. Not necessarily just the number of trees on the street without considering other aspects, which tends to be often what municipal foresters are forced to do, simply looking at numbers and dealing with the built structure as they have it, and trying to work with that entity and trying to maximize the benefits as best they can within those constraints. As I say, canopy cover is the usual measure that we use, and it's good for many ways. It's intuitive. We can look down at an aerial photograph and get a feeling for 50% canopy cover, 20% canopy cover, 100% canopy cover. And of course, it's also very inexpensive to estimate. All you need is the aerial photograph and a dot grid and a little bit of training. Takes you 5 minutes to learn how to do it, so that's appealing. Unfortunately, it's two-dimensional, obviously. It's not really looking at that canopy in 3 dimensions, and related with that, it has no bearing on tree size. Again, you're only looking at the canopy as a single entity in 2 dimensions. So you're not dealing with the depth of the crowns of the individual trees. It doesn't account for species variation. And we could argue that, well, if you're looking at an aerial photograph, you might be able to tell the difference between a Norway maple and a crab apple from the aerial photograph. That's not the point. When you're calculating canopy cover, you're just really, is it tree cover, or is it grass, or is it hard surface, or rooftop? So that it doesn't really deal with those variations between species. And again, think of a Norway maple canopy, or a Norway maple crown, and a honey locust crown. Are they the same? I don't think so. So it's important that we incorporate that. And of course, it doesn't account for tree condition, which is an important thing from the ground level managing that resource. So it has some benefits, but it has some drawbacks. So I've mentioned leaf area density as a possible alternative, and it doesn't answer all the problems, but I think it's another way of looking at this that provides some certain advantages. So leaf area density is just the sum of the surface area of all the leaves growing in a particular unit of land. It could be a community, it could be a block within a community, or simply in a building lot, or per hectare. So you're expressing it on an area basis. It's not leaf area index, which would be expressed as the projection, the crown projection. So that in certain areas it's a little bit different. The best way to picture that is a big maple sitting in the middle of a field. And the leaf area density of that is fairly well defined because the crown projection is finite in essence. But if we make the field smaller and smaller and smaller, moving the fences in, the leaf area density continues to go up. So it means that way we can look at different issues around different land use types and so on. So it's a little bit different than leaf area density. We're looking at 2 definitions of that, or 2 divisions of that. the existing leaf area density, or what's on the ground now, the existing forest, and potential leaf area density. And we'll get into that in a little bit. So a little bit more of this. So this is Dave Nowak's equation, or at least the equation developed by that group to estimate leaf area. This is derived from theirs to define leaf area density. And it's simply a regression equation determined from a number of measurements, crown characteristic measurements, and then they actually take sections out of the crown and remove the leaves and measure the leaf area and do a regression analysis on that. I put it up here really to highlight the point, coming back to the difference with canopy cover, that in this case we've got the H, which is the crown height. So now we're looking at the urban forest in 3 dimensions. We've got the crown diameter, which is what we would normally see, or an aspect of that we would see from the canopy cover. But we've also got shading factor, and that really is in essence a factor that's brought in to differentiate between species, to account for that difference between the dense canopy of the Norway maple and the very light crown of the honey locust and things in between. So we've accounted for the 3 dimensions, and we've got a species factor in here. Now what we're doing is with our issues on the ground, when we're collecting this inventory data, we're also incorporating a measure of canopy condition, or a condition factor. So it means that we can then take that theoretical leaf area as calculated from the regression equation and reduce it for the condition of the crown. So if it's been topped or it's had a lot of defoliation for one reason or another, we can adjust for that. So we're looking at tree condition now as well. And then we simply sum that all up and express it over the area of land that we're dealing with, the lot or the hectare or whatever. From that regression, a number of points come out, and this is probably, to my mind, the most important issue that I'm dealing with here today, is the fact that the leaf area of a particular tree will increase exponentially with the size of the tree. And so it's not linear, obviously, really overstating it here. But if you're starting to look at these issues of, do we want a number of trees, or do we want carefully chosen healthy trees that have the potential to become very large, which as an urban forester, that is more appealing to me than just sticking trees in the ground. A number of points come home then. What are we doing in our planning and managing of the urban forest that prevent us from moving out along this axis to the right-hand side, where we're going to be maximizing the canopy volume, the leaf area, and thereby maximizing those benefits? And what factors are keeping us off to the left on the bottom axis and minimizing our opportunity to reach that potential? So let's talk about some of those issues, and again, in terms of urban forest planning and management. So what are some of the determinants of leaf area density? What factors on the ground determine leaf area density? Well, the number of trees. Surprise, surprise. That makes a lot of sense. And that deals with the issue of sticking trees in the ground and appeasing the politicians who see tree planting as being the only thing that happens in urban forestry, and let's not worry about maintaining the trees that are on the ground right now. Sorry if I'm cynical, but it makes for a great photo op, but it doesn't deal with some of the other issues. Tree species is important. If we're comparing crab apples to white oaks, which ones are going to be have the potential to move the forest out along the right, to the right of that axis? Tree age, you've got a white oak that's that big DBH, and you've got a crab apple the same size. Obviously, there's going to be some differences there, but it's not as dramatic as the difference when that large, or that tree that has the large genetic potential reaches that genetic potential. And tree condition, okay? And let's bring up this diagram again and think of particularly the 2 things in the middle. What do we do in our planning the urban forest, managing the urban forest, and everything else that goes on in that urban forest to prevent us from moving out to the right and maximizing that? When we're widening roads and reducing the potential growing space, or the available growing space, when we're putting that trench down the boulevard to put in yet another utility, and we do that every 20 years and cut half the root system off every tree in 20 years, those trees, be they white oaks or crab apples, are moving out along here, and boom, they get trenched, so they move back. And then when we make an argument that you can't put that trench there, you're going to kill all these trees, the argument might be, well, you know, this is an expensive job we're doing here, and the cost of replacing those trees is quite minimal in terms of putting in this utility. And so we just pull those trees out or let them die and then replace them. And that's okay as long as you're happy staying out on the left-hand side. But if your objective is to move out here, you've got to come at things entirely differently. Unfortunately, the technology is coming around now that we can look at that sort of thing. These issues, again, relate back to available growing space. And that, again, is another issue in terms of this idea of looking at the urban forest as an ecosystem and the need to bring urban forest planning to the table when everything else is being planned in that municipality. And I know this is a very, maybe a naive perspective, but I think that's at least the trajectory that we have to be working along to try to get us to the stage where urban forest planning has a place at the table, or the urban forest has a place at the planning table, if you will. So let's look at some of these issues briefly. And not surprisingly, land use type has a crucial impact on it. We get into this high density area, high density residential area down here. There's not a lot of growing space in that particular part of the city for any trees. This is where you're lucky if you can get a tree to grow in a pot for 5 or 10 years. But as we move out into the residential zones, we can see that simply there's more growing space there to support more trees. Now, interestingly enough, when we look at the city of Toronto, the medium density and low density residential represent about half the city. So there is an opportunity there to expand some of that urban forest canopy. I've done this a bit with various groups, and it's really quite interesting to start off, say, without even putting this picture up, visualize a tree. I started out with some students in a class. I actually passed papers out and said, draw me a picture of a tree. What I wanted to do up front was to see if they understood the proportions of a tree, that a tree can be as wide as it is tall. Anyway, I did that, and this was a class of foresters and landscape architects, and of about 40 students that came back, all but about 3 had something really interesting. And that interesting note was that all but 3 didn't have roots. And you'd be surprised how many people, engineers, foresters, landscape architects, anybody you want, they visualize from the ground up. Now, my arborist friends tell me that 80%, something in the order of 80% of tree problems really originate from the ground line down. And so that's another challenge for us, to be looking at the urban forest ecosystem from the ground line down. And it's too easy to just forget about it. When you look at a drawing, and I know you won't be able to see the details here, but it gives you some idea of the competition for growing space that boulevard trees in particular are faced with. All these utilities below ground competing for space with the root system. And remember, these utilities don't go in the ground and stay there for 100 years. They've got to be upgraded, problems come up, and there's damage to root systems as things go along. A couple of other points on this diagram. You notice that the trees that are here don't have any roots. They're just conveniently propped up on the pavement. And there's another thing, I really regret having cut this off. This was from a drawing, a spec from the town of Oakville. I can say that down here. I can't say Oakville when I show this slide back home, because then the forester from Oakville will be all over me. But the part that I cut off, I noticed, it didn't have anything to do with what I wanted to show, but the spec said the contractor will provide 80 millimeters of topsoil in the boulevard. 80 millimeters, that was the spec, folks. That's enough maybe to keep some turf going. And as when I pointed this out to an arborist friend, he says, yeah, that's the spec. If you think you're going to get what the spec is, you've got another thing coming too. So you might not even get the 80 millimeters. So the point being, again, that the tree root system, in spite of all of there are, as well as all this competition below ground, doesn't really get a lot of attention in terms of the planning phase. To be able to establish and support itself to move out along that bottom axis that we were talking about earlier. So maximizing the leaf area just in one place doesn't really make sense either. We've also got to look at how that's distributed across the community. And I usually get myself into trouble with this one as well, but it's a point I'm trying to make, so we'll go with this. And you've all seen this, this quote, well, one large tree can evaporate as much water as 5 room-sized air conditioners operating 24 hours a day or something like that. And evidently, if you do the back-of-the-envelope calculations, that's true. The implication is that this one large tree has the same cooling effect as 5 room-sized air conditioners. What they usually don't say is how you get the tree into the house in order to do that cooling. And so, of course, that tree is trying to cool an infinite volume of air as it's sitting out there in my front yard. Now, if I had 5 room-sized air conditioners sitting on the front yard, I don't know whether that would noticeably cool my local environment or not. The point I'm trying to illustrate is that if everybody had 5 room-sized air conditioners on the front yard, maybe the community would be cooler. I don't know, but you know what I'm trying to get at? That if we look at that individual tree sitting on the individual front yard, that's nice, that's important. But we also have to look at how all the trees within the community influence the environment as per 5 room-sized air conditioners. I had a student point out that none of this would do any cooling anyway because the air conditioner is just circulating the air.
There's a law of physics that applies.
There is, yeah, and there's always one student in the class that's prepared to point that out when you're trying to make another point. Anyway, this, you can't see it, but that's a park, okay? It's really dark, but you see this nice little park in this community, closed canopy, nice deep crowns, old mature trees. It's obviously playing a really important part in the environment in any definition for this particular community. It's really important there. But if we look at where that's situated in terms of distributing this leaf area density, we just scan out, and you have to say, okay, it's important to the community, but how far does that importance travel? Well, I'm prepared to stick my neck out and say it probably doesn't travel very much beyond the center line of the road around. These folks over here in these gentrified row houses are looking out on a forest. They're not aware of all of this stuff around them. But in terms of having an impact on air quality or energy conservation, even property value, with the exception of those few homes there, is probably not doing very much. Again, my point is, how do we distribute that open space across the community is crucial, and looking at the urban forest as an ecosystem. Okay, potential leaf area density. I've sort of left the idea of leaf area density and the existing leaf area density. Now, what about this idea of looking at potential leaf area density? Well, what is it, first of all? It's just the carrying capacity, or the leaf area that could be carried by a particular unit of land, whether it's a community, a neighborhood, or an individual lot. So it's the potential for that piece of property in the city to carry leaf area, as was defined before. Why would we use it? Well, first of all, it's a measure, as I said, of carrying capacity, potential, the ability of that land to carry urban forest. It also incorporates vegetation characteristics like the number of trees, the species, the age, and the condition. Remember how we calculated that in that equation of Dave Nowak's. We're doing the same sort of thing, and I'll show you in a minute how we estimated that. So it's incorporating more than simply canopy cover does. And it also incorporates certain characteristics of the built environment. And I'll show you what I mean by that when I describe how we estimate it. Well, first of all, let's go through this quickly here. We stratified the city by land use type, just so that we're comparing Granny Smiths and Macintoshes at least, where we established 400 square meter circular plots, and this was done in conjunction with the work that we were doing with Dave Nowak. So I'm not saying that this is the ideal plot size for our purposes. We're still working through this, but it was an opportunity to try this process out. We transit surveyed everything in those 400 square meters. Every sidewalk edge, every flower bed, every building, every tree, and we defined all of those things with a transit survey as accurately as we possibly could. Digitized, put it in the GIS system, the GIS, not the GIS system. And once we had it in there, we then applied some buffers and determined plantable space. Where can we put trees in there given certain restrictions? Once we did that, we planted some prototype trees, again using the GIS, and tried to maximize the leaf area that we could squeeze into these particular areas. And then, because we knew the leaf area of those prototype trees, we could calculate the potential leaf area density of each plot. So let's look at some of these on the ground. So here's one plot that we actually surveyed. And this is what it looked like. Let's pull the trees out and get a closer look. So what we've got there, the blue is building. See if I can remember what these are. These are buildings, sidewalk. This is patio stone, I believe. And I believe this is, I can't remember. It's another type of hard surface. I can't remember what colors I used in here. But the point being, these are basically all hard surfaces out here, with the green being a soft surface as defined by that. And you can see we actually surveyed beyond the perimeters of our 400 square meters, because if you've got a street sign or a road intersection here, it may be outside your plot, but its area of influence comes in to the plot. So we had to go beyond that. So there's the soft surface. This is what we might think of initially as being what's available for planting. But in reality, when we add buffers to that, and we went to the various municipalities in our area and said, what sort of a buffer do you have for tree planting next to buildings, next to sidewalks, next to utilities and so on? And we applied those various buffers to all these features we'd surveyed out, and our soft surface then is dramatically reduced down to what we have here. So that's really what's available for planting given these various buffers. Then we took our trees, our prototype trees, and planted them using the GIS. We put in the big tree, the largest trees first of all, 20 meters tall, and I can't remember the particular characteristics of those, but we planted the large trees first because we want to maximize that leaf area density. We could have just stuck small trees in all over the place. That wouldn't have maximized it. When we couldn't get any more big trees in, then we put the medium-sized trees in. When we ran out of room for medium-sized trees, we filled in what was left over with our small prototype trees. Then for each of those plots, we just tallied up the number of each size class, calculated the leaf area density, and used that as an estimate of our potential leaf area density. This is the first time we've tried to do this, and this is what we've got for the City of Toronto. We have some questions about it yet. We're refining it, but I think there's some interesting things that come out. This is potential leaf area density is the burgundy, and the existing leaf area density is the blue. And as you can see, in a lot of cases, in most cases, we've got more potential than we have existing, which is what we would expect to see. We see a lot of variation in some of them. And again, this is plots that are pooled to be quite, and particularly in some of these areas, for example, special purpose. That's the exhibition grounds in Toronto and a few other areas. So it's a sort of an anomalous land use type, but we were stuck with it. So huge variation there. But what's more interesting, again, remember, this represents about half the area of the City of Toronto. And we're seeing that the potential leaf area density declines as we go from residential low to residential high. And we're seeing consistently more potential than existing, although over here it's not statistically significant, and it is just statistically significant there. So that's what we would expect to see. So that's kind of an interesting bit of additional information that we can look at, and I'll talk about what we can do with that information in a minute. But first of all, I've alluded to this problem that we came up with, where we have situations where we have more existing than we have potential. So those sites are super saturated, if you wanted to say that. So what the heck is going on here? but we brainstormed this a little bit and I think we came up with a few possibilities, and some of them are just problems with the process that we applied. First of all, the prototype tree size may have been conservative. Our largest tree wasn't as big as the biggest tree you're going to see in the city of Toronto. That doesn't bother me because those big trees were planted or were established 100 years ago in an entirely different growing environment. Can we get a tree under the current building and environment that they're expected to grow in to reach that potential? I don't think so. It's an entirely different way of building, and it's an entirely different environment. So I'm happy with our more conservative estimate of the size of those prototype trees. Prototype trees were all hardwoods. We didn't, although we were incorporating and addressing the conifers in the existing leaf area, our prototype trees were really reflecting conifers only. So we may have underestimated there a little bit. And tree placement was conservative. We didn't have crowns overlapping. The way we set them up is the drip lines were the buffer. And of course, that's not reality. I think we've got to deal with that. We've got to look at that again and see what sort of adjustments we can make to make that a little bit more realistic. In open areas, of course, we had vertical structure